All right. Have you shared your screen yet?
I
There,
am going to share my slides. Let me know when this is visible.
I got it now. Good to go.
Okay, awesome. So first of all, Kevin, thank you for the invite. Was really excited to finish in Pittsburgh and have an immediate, second opportunity lined up to share this. Made some refinements after the first go around. I think thanks to Dan, who said that I think it was Dan. Yeah, so somebody saw me in Pittsburgh and said it was a good session. I appreciate that. I was so nervous about it not having enough content that it turned into, I almost had too much content. I'll try to adjust the pace this time and leave plenty of room for demos. But by all means, if you have questions, speak up or raise your hand and we'll jump into it. So again, thanks for the opportunity. Happy to be here. A little bit about me. My name is Andrew Boerger. I live and work in Bellefontaine, Ohio, although I frequently am traveling to the Detroit area and the Louisville area. And I work for a company called AGC. We make automotive glass, so safety glass, windshields, side glass, backlights. Check your vehicles. There's a decent chance that we make the glass in your vehicle. We make something like 30% of automotive glass globally. And we have a small data team. It's me and one other BI developer and one data scientist. And that's kind of my background. I will post the slides to my LinkedIn at some point after this. And I will try to get the notebooks and some of the sample code shared in a repo as well, but for sure the slides. A little more background. I am an accidental data professional, so I didn't get into this as a career path. I began on the production floor at a factory. I was doing all kinds of, I've had a strange career path. I've been an auditor, I've been a metrologist, I've been kind of on the IT infrastructure side, but for the last I would say 4 or 5 years or so, I've been in the BI space and definitely in the last 3 years, almost exclusively working with Power BI and now Fabric. My team, we participated in the Fabric Hackathon earlier this year. We did place in one of the categories, which was a lot of fun. Went and got my DP 600, and I've been administering our premium capacity for the last 4 years, and we've been interacting with Fabric since day one. As soon as public preview kicked off, we were in there creating objects and testing things out. So not an MVP, not anything like that. I'm just a passionate user, and I'm going to be coming from that perspective of fundamentally this is what I do day to day, and I'm not in the consulting space or anything like that at this time. Again, I'm coming to you from our North American business unit. This is a global organization. I am one data team maintaining the infrastructure for one business unit. We've got about 2,700 employees. We've been on the Microsoft stack for quite a while now. The business got into Power BI before the IT side did. And then when we went through an ERP transformation about 4 years ago, we decided to go with premium and start getting more into the Azure side of things as far as our data goes. And again, have been using Fabric since it became available. Again, disclaimers, I can't really speak about all the subtleties and differences if you're working in things like government cloud or DoD. I'm not the best at perhaps knowing what features are going to be locked behind this or that type of capacity premium versus if you're working with just pro licenses. That being said, I'll try to call that out where possible, where things are going to be available or not available. And the most important thing, I'm not going to be making prescriptions and this is the way to do monitoring and this is what you should do. My perspective, I'm coming to you from this is what we do, this is what we have found useful. These are the things we developed in order to fit our priorities. And of course, as you get into the space, your priorities may be something entirely different. And then I have no private preview access or kind of insider information about the roadmap, but I will show you some stuff at the end that is on the public roadmap that I think is going to be very important in this space. So why monitoring? So monitoring, I break it down into four categories. what are we doing in Power BI and Fabric? What are we creating? How much could we be doing? And what are our obligations? So there's 4 categories. Again, it's usage, inventory, capacity, and compliance. So I'm going to go through a series of different data sources that are going to inform each of these categories. But you may have one of these that's much more of a priority than the others. If you're getting into that Fabric or premium space, you may be working with a smaller capacity, and your top priority is going to be capacity management and making good use of the capacity metrics. For us, it was more about understanding user patterns and understanding our inventory. We mostly make do with kind of the built-in capacity monitoring. And then again, at the bottom, if you work with, maybe you have internal audit, maybe you have regulatory areas that you need to adhere to, you may have certain obligations around user access reporting, around knowing what's being exported, things like that. So reasons you may want to monitor. One thing I like to address from the get-go is there's sometimes governance and oversight and control. These are kind of dirty words, especially if you're coming from the business side versus the IT side. IT is usually very interested in really good, robust central monitoring. Sometimes, if we're a little too concerned about that, there can be a perception that this is just a mechanism to lock things down and control what people are doing. That's not how I think about it whatsoever. I've been on the business and the IT side of this. And fundamentally, when we're doing monitoring, I'm doing it to try to make everybody's experience better and to see where maybe we're doing something that's not a best practice. Maybe we're doing something that could be optimized. Maybe access rights are not appropriate. At the end of the day, it's about making sure that things are running smoothly and that people are using content that they should be using, and people are aware of content. And kind of the audience I geared this session for, it's going to be most useful, in my opinion, if you are a Power BI or Fabric admin, if you're on kind of that central BI team persona, whether that central BI team is in or out of IT. But I think there'll be useful tricks in here, even if you're if you're just creating content, if you're a workspace admin, there may be things about this that you can take back to whoever your dedicated Fabric admin is to implement or suggest. So let's go through a few scenarios that might inform why we build monitoring. So this first one is around report usage. So you get a call from your CFO and she says, hey, we did these fantastic SG&A cost center reports last quarter. Can you show me if our cost center owners are actually using them to manage their spend? How often, who's using them? I want to see that report because we want to be able to drive the adoption. And it's a good sign when your stakeholders are engaged enough to ask a question like that. Maybe it doesn't happen very often, but eventually it will happen. Somebody will want to say, hey, can we see who is viewing this report? I want to follow up or with the people who are not. Can you answer that question? Just the basic question of who is using what. Second would be capacity usage. So you don't want to get that dreaded email that says, hey, you're at 100% usage, the throttling has begun, and you have no idea why or what happened. You better be able to jump into that capacity metrics app. You better have that installed, know where it is, and at least how to read it, which could honestly be a session all by itself. That's a complicated app. You may want to do some monitoring around licensing. So you may want to say, let's say you have a lot of Power BI Pro licenses in your environment. It's perfectly valid. You may want to look at these once a year and say, who's actually using the features that Pro brings us? If we have Pro licensees and all they're doing is viewing content, but we're also on premium, we don't need to maintain these licenses. We need to make sure that they're being issued to the people who are actually publishing and developing content. Usage patterns. So we all know the folks from the business who love real time, and they say, how often can you refresh? That's the number that I want. That's how often I want my model to refresh, is as fast as possible. So when you're dealing with stakeholders like that, it's very nice to be able to look at the actual usage patterns and see if some of these requests are justified. It's one thing to bump up the refresh on a report that has hundreds of daily users. It's another thing when you've got somebody who has a very heavy unoptimized model with 1 or 2 users per day and they're asking for that same request. And then user permissions kind of in that compliance area. So you may have internal audit requirements. You may do user access review from an IT perspective. So at some point, if you're in that kind of environment, somebody's going to come to you and they're going to say, hey, we want to know who has access to what. We want to see, for example, who has access anything beyond a read type of access to a workspace, who is a capacity admin. Can you generate that report on demand for everything in your environment? That's something that's very tricky to do out of the box. And then I highly, highly recommend after we go through this session, go back and check out the Power BI implementation planning. They have an entire section on auditing and monitoring that's really, really good. And I just pulled some of the questions out of that implementation plan of these are the types of things that we're trying to answer of where are the views happening, what content might be more critical, and you may want to take a look at the underlying infrastructure for that, who's managing those refreshes, where could we have some problems in the future. Do we have content that is not certified or is not endorsed, but nevertheless is being widely viewed throughout the organization? Do you have an opportunity there to have an ownership handoff or to at least take a look at that content? Because as soon as you start monitoring your environment, you're going to see these things, right? You're going to see somebody develops a new solution and the popularity just spikes. And, it's always good to follow up with those people and help them out where you can from a central BI perspective. And then looking at just usage patterns in general, do you have critical reports that are only critical on the first of the month during financial close, or do you have things that are critical 3 times a day as a shift is ending? Just understanding what the patterns are and maybe having those documented. So when you get a ticket in that a refresh has failed, you know exactly what the impact might be. And then more on the user side or the consumer side, just knowing who are my active users, who are the people that have wide access and are viewing content in all these different areas, who's publishing content, how many users could you possibly have, so you could cross-reference the access that you've granted with the people who are actually using that access, and then being able to tell things like, when was the last time this person viewed anything? Did you have a very heavy user who suddenly hasn't viewed anything for 2 weeks? Maybe worth following up with that person and seeing what changed. And I see somebody in the chat was saying they're having trouble with the content. Is anybody else having that? I can
No,
reshare. I can reshare if
I
needed.
think you're fine. It might be on their end, so he
Okay.
might need to log out and log back in.
Okay. Yep. And just anybody else, if you have an issue with my presentation here, just speak up, because I will be transitioning out of the slides and into a live demo here shortly. Some things you may want to measure. So in our environment, we prioritized these metrics. You may have entirely different metrics you want to prioritize. That's fine. We kind of took the approach that you'll see with a lot of SaaS kind of monitoring of how many active users do we have a month, per week, per day, and looking at the ratios between those. So it can kind of tell you about the report. If you have a very high ratio of daily to monthly active users, that tells you if I've got 100 people who view this report every month, and I've got the same 100 people are viewing it every day, that tells me it's vital to something that they're doing on a daily basis, versus something where you still have those 100 monthly users, but day to day, I mean, maybe they're looking at it once a week or once a month, right? So you may have the same number of users, but it's a completely different usage pattern. We get this quite a bit because we're in the manufacturing space. You're going to see those manufacturing type of reports that show you production quantities and yields. Those tend to be multiple times a day, very hardcore users looking at those within a shift, at the end of a shift, versus a financial report, which could be just as critical, but it's only critical at a certain time of the month. Other things, again, the ratio, the views themselves, and then exports. So it's always good to see who is exporting to Excel, where is that happening? Are you intending for that to happen? Because you may have designed that report with export at the front of your mind, but maybe if you see something that you kind of thought it was all all-inclusive solution, so you may be surprised to see how many people are exporting from something that's unexpected. Okay, out of the box, I'm going to focus a little bit less on out of the box solutions this time. I did these demos in Pittsburgh. I will touch on them, but I want to have a lot of time to do the custom monitoring demos. But out of the box, you're going to get your capacity metrics, which is going to tell you how many CUs that you're using, how much storage you're using. And if you're on premium or fabric, that's going to be critical. You're going to want to look at that. And honestly, I would just probably use that report and try to master what Microsoft provides out of the box. If you want to do anything, I would just use the default semantic model and perhaps create some custom reporting on top of that. I think there's going to be some things coming in the future. I'll touch on those at the end, but I don't have a lot of custom content around capacity metrics to show you. That'll be, we mostly leverage the built-in direct query model that Microsoft gives us. With Fabric, I believe this was simultaneous with Fabric Public Preview. We have this workspace called the Admin Monitoring Workspace. I will go through a demo of the content that's available in that. You get some basic inventory, basic usage metrics. The main limitation you're going to see with anything out of the box for monitoring is the window of time. So capacity metrics is going to be a 14-day look back of what are your CU trends over the last 14 days. When it comes to usage metrics, you're going to see that for the last 30 days. And after 30 days have passed, that data is gone forever. So one of those things that you may want to think about as you start your adoption journey is having that data. Even if you don't know what to do with it yet, I'm going to show you the data sources, but you're going to want to start collecting this stuff and saving it to a data source or a data store that you have control over. So even if you're not quite sure what you may want to look at in the future, you're starting to retain these records instead of having to deal with that native 30-day look-back period. And I'm going to come back to this demo, so we're going to skip over that. And when you start thinking about custom monitoring, you may find that you don't want to do custom at all. So in our case, it made sense because we had more time, energy, and passion than we did budget. So we thought, well, let's build it ourselves and see what we can do. But if you're the other way around and you have limited time and limited effort, you've got a lot of business priorities that are kind of taxing. This may be something that you want to explore, but look, you don't have time to kind of roll your own solution on this. In that case, I recommend looking at, there's many paid options out there. I have not purchased any of these. I have experience only in a few cases with the public demos that are out there. But I'm going to call out 4 of them. You've got Argus, you've got Power BI Sentinel, you've got Rockfeather. There's all kinds of solutions out there. And then the newest one I've been seeing quite a bit has been Measure Killer. So this is Greg Brunner's app, and he's got this feature called tenant analysis, which is going to give you a complete inventory of your Fabric tenant. It's going to let you scan for best practice rules and things like that. So you may start this journey and say, look, all this is great. I don't have time to build it myself. Just you may want to look at some of these options, and that would be completely fine. So again, why would we build it? To retain our own data indefinitely. You may have other internal data sources that you want to cross-reference. So for us, we certainly did. We wanted to pull data from our ticketing system, from Active Directory, from Microsoft Graph. We have other ETL tools outside of Fabric that we want to look at the logs for, cross-reference the two, look at our SAP ETLs and compare them with the data set refreshes in Fabric, things like that. And for us, we didn't have any urgent requirements in this area. This was actually the first thing that we stood up and played around with in Fabric. The whole idea was we use our monitoring solution as a test bed. Whenever there's a new Fabric feature, whenever there's something new in Semantic Link Labs, we're going to be testing it here, right? So it's something that's very much for an internal team. You may have portions of this which are business facing, but they're not going to be it's not going to be as critical of a solution. We can have a lot of testing and development take place and use this data. So it was a great learning experience when you're starting to work with notebooks, lake houses, things like that. Start pulling from these monitoring APIs and retaining the data, because it's going to be a great real world demo that at the end of it, when you build a POC, not only it doesn't just go away, you can actually continue to use it. We didn't actually, just to kind of paint the story here before we get into the demos, we didn't initially start with Fabric. Even a few years ago, there's some solutions in the space if you wanted to query these administrative APIs in an easy, low-code way. So there is a native connector out there from Miguel Escobar, who's now on the data flows team. At the time, I think he developed this before he joined Microsoft, but he developed a REST API custom connector for Power Query. I think there's a newer one. I think there's a few different versions of this. If you look out there, there's been several folks that have implemented connections to these REST APIs strictly through Power Query. And that can be a fantastic way to get started, especially if all you want to do is, let's say, scan a certain set of artifacts for access or just build an inventory. You can have a good experience just with a low code tool like this. It's when you get into the complete tenant scanning, the retaining the activity logs, dealing with some of these more complex APIs, it becomes trickier to do that in Power Query. Not impossible, but definitely trickier. The overall solution I'm going to go through is going to be completely Fabric based. So we have an orchestration pipeline. We've got a series of notebooks that call different administrative APIs. I'm going to dial in and focus on three APIs and then one tool that's in Semantic Link Labs called the Best Practice Analyzer bulk. We're going to go and get all of these particular data sources. We're going to save them to our Bronze Lakehouse. So we're going to, first of all, just retain it. We're going to retain all this data for as long as we can. That's going to be append-only storage. We're going to keep it into the future, even if we don't know what to do with it yet. And then from there, we can start to transform that raw data into useful products. And at the end of this, what I'll show is a nice gold lakehouse with nice clean tables with all of our user access, with our inventory of semantic models, with our user activity logs, and our BPA scan results. So if you take nothing else from the technical side, just know that if you want to get into this, I recommend focusing on the top two data sources here. So there's a series of APIs called the metadata scanning APIs. These are going to be your best friend when it comes to building that inventory. So these are a little bit more complex. There's actually a series of 4 APIs with this that I'll get into the details, but this is going to give you back a full payload that contains every item within a workspace, all of the DAX expressions within a model, all of the user access to those items, things like the endorsement status, the sensitivity label, the descriptions, all the metadata that you would want from that Fabric item is going to come back from this metadata scan. And then you're going to combine that. So that's your inventory. And then you combine that with activity events, which is going to get you your usage. So activity events is a very wide log. So every time anybody does any action within Power BI, they're going to generate something in this activity events data source. I think there's a native GUI for this if you're a Microsoft 365 admin. I am not, so I've never seen the native log. I think there's a tool that you can get to from the admin center that lets you query these. These are only available for the last 30 days. I think maybe if you're a 365 admin, you can go back 90 days. I'm not 100% sure about that. But the activity events is going to be your second critical building block. You're going to want to go and start collecting those every day as soon as possible, because then you can retain them indefinitely. We have at this point about 14 months of activity events data. And if you're looking at any of the built-in reports, you're going to only be seeing the last 30. And then between those are the two most important by far. You're still going to find other admin APIs that are useful to add in on top of that. Particularly, I've noticed with deployments, if you want to retain every single production deployment, for example, which is something that would be quite logical if you're using deployment pipelines, you may find that the activity events shows that the deployment happened, but it doesn't necessarily have all of the detail that you can get to through the GUI about that deployment. So there's a series of other admin APIs that we'll collect data from. And with that, I'm actually going to cut the PowerPoint short and we'll go into demos, and I will kind of show this on the fly instead of going through the rest of the presentation. That being said, when I share these slides, I will give you certain things like links to each of these admin APIs, the overall process flows for each of them, and just some recommendations in that area. But I'm going to show these through the browser instead. So let me know when you can see my screen instead, and we'll get into the demos.
Got it. Looks good.
Okay. And then let's also pause here before I actually get into demos. Are there any questions that I can kind of tackle right off the bat, just about our general mindset? Not necessarily a technical question, but anything around what our priorities or focus was when we built the solution.
Nobody's put anything into the chat except Fernando did put the hashtag semantic link everything. So it seems to
I
be
want to
going that way, right?
Yeah, I want to make sure I have room for the semantic link at the end, because I think the story that we're going to tell here is that some of the things that we have to do the hard way, so to speak, with the APIs, with Semantic Link Labs and everything Michael Kowalski's doing, we're getting these nice wrappers for these APIs that make it so easy that I think even if even if you don't have the time to build this thing out in a fully fleshed out way, you can use Semantic Link Labs and collect some of this data in an extremely easy way.
All right, let's see what you got.
Okay, so let's get in. I'm going to quickly kind of show the out of the box. So what's useful about the out of the box admin monitoring is you do get the semantic models that you can connect to if you're trying to do some basic inventory reporting and you're not necessarily concerned about the past. All you want to know is what is currently out there. You can use these. So you can use the Purview Hub semantic model, and you can use these two built-in reports. You get a basic view of your activities. You are going to probably find very quickly that this may answer the most basic questions, but you're going to want to customize this much more so than what you get out of the box. Everything is kind of broken down into users and activities and capacities. But again, you're going to be dealing with this 30-day time range. But this is very welcome. I'm hoping that this out of the box monitoring gets better over time, because it used to be not so long ago that we couldn't even get a capacity wide usage report. You would have to go in and right click your reports and go into the usage monitoring and generate that individually for every report that you wanted to look at usage for. Not a great experience. I don't touch those usage reports anymore, the per report ones. It's much better to collect this stuff holistically for the entire capacity or your entire tenant if you have many capacities in play. But worth investigating if you just need something out of the box. And then with the Purview, so they have introduced some newer reporting that shows us things like sensitivity label application, endorsements. If you're using domains, you can kind of see what workspaces are assigned to domains, and you can get in and view individual items. I more think of these. What's really useful to me about these is the out of the box inventory. This is going to be maybe where you want to begin, is connecting to this model through Power BI desktop or Excel, and building a custom solution on top of that. If you wanted to just dip your toes into this area, just starting with the reports in mind of what kind of report would I want to build, and then worrying about the model later.
So Andrew, there is a question it's probably good to take right now.
Yeah, let's do it.
It says Purview Hub is paid, correct? So
That's a good question. I believe so. In order to see admin monitoring, from what I understand, you need to at least be a capacity admin. I don't think the admin monitoring workspace will appear otherwise. And with that, I think it is going to be tied with premium capacity or fabric capacity. But if anybody knows for sure, please jump in with that detail.
yeah, so for this, what you're showing within Fabric slash Power BI, the service, you're right. You have to be a tenant level admin. And then being a tenant level admin, you could see this. And what this is inventorying for you is your Fabric slash Power BI service information. There's no extra license for that, and I believe even if you're only using pro licenses, you get this. Um, but there is another actual tool called Purview that is
Yeah.
installed within Azure, and somebody did reply that it's $50 per user per month, and that licensing model recently changed. Now it is more per um, I think it's asset that, and I haven't read on this correctly, so excuse me if I'm wrong, but I've seen it in a couple places. I believe it's on the larger level asset that you're governing rather than a purview, but there then rather than a per user. But there is a different purview tool. Be aware there's license changes. There's a lot of better YouTube sites out there than what I've been doing. Um, I will be learning more about that very, very soon. So, but the pricing model did just change. And then I see your question out there. I'm going to hold that because it's not really related to Andrew's presentation. So if we have time at the end, we could brainstorm some type of things. But actually, this is the type of question that would be good to show up on our Thursday session, that we just have an open discussion and say, hey, can somebody help me with this? So from there, Andrew, go ahead and continue. Thanks.
Okay, great. And yeah, that's a great question because I didn't even think because they've named this Purview Hub, because it has Purview in the name, it could hint that it somehow has to do with the paid version of Microsoft Purview. Well, we don't pay for that within my organization, so I can't speak to that, but definitely you don't have to be paying for Purview separately in order to get to this hub detail. You just have to have the appropriate admin access. As we get into because the primary source of data for some of the custom monitoring is going to be the admin APIs, I want to at least touch on the admin portal settings. So if you're going to be using some automation with the service principal, which I recommend having a service principal that these notebooks can authenticate with, you're going to want to make sure that your service principals can access these read-only admin APIs. So you're going to see a few settings to that effect here. You're also going to have a setting that enhances the responses with detailed metadata. And what this actually does is when you are using the scanner, the metadata scanning APIs, you can go all the way down to the table, column, and measure level within a semantic model and get all that detail back. So if you have this enabled, not only can you inventory your semantic models, but you can inventory all of the DAX and the M code and the descriptions, and you can build out a full data catalog without having to do anything like looping through the models or even though the info DAX functions, those new views that have recently been introduced, they're very useful. They're kind of one model at a time versus the metadata scanning APIs, which will give you all this information back for many, many workspaces all at the same time. So definitely enable that. And then again, the bottom one is going to make sure that you actually get the DAX expressions and the M code expressions. So you'll get a table definition that tells you, here's the power query that's being used in this table. Here's the DAX that's being used in this calculated column or this measure. And you'll get all that back from within the scanning API. So with that, let's get into more of the solution view. So again, I'm going to go back to just the task flow of kind of what I'm going to go through. So I'm going to go over each of these 4 notebooks and explain my data sources. And then I will show a little bit of how we transform and then some of the reporting we do at the very end. Another disclaimer here, I'm not a professional Python developer. This was one of the first projects we did within Fabric. So if you see some code that's kind of ugly, well, it probably is ugly, but it does work. So first thing I'm going to show is the Get Activity Events API. This is probably the second most complex API you'll need to deal with, but also one of the most important because you want to use this and get a list of all the events that have occurred within the tenant. You're going to do that at the level of day by day, and you can go up to 30 days in the past. So when you do this for the first time, you're going to want to go back and probably capture all of these logs from the earliest date, which is available. And then if you're going to be running this in kind of an ETL mode each day, you're probably going to want to go back and only look at the logs from just the previous day. This API does support incremental approaches. So what that means is you can pass in the beginning and ending time for the activities as a parameter. So when I go and get my activity events, I can specify my start and end date, and that's going to improve the performance. So I'm not loading the 30 days every single time. The larger your environment is, the more important that the performance is going to be, because you can easily have hundreds of thousands, probably more events per day. With the introduction of Fabric, you have all kinds of query activities and just these very granular activities that are being added to the logs that never existed before. So very important that you're mindful of the performance implications when you're reading entire days at a time. But this is just kind of some boilerplate code that authenticates to the API, gets its tokens. And then with the activity events, it actually provides a continuation token. So it's going to give you up to a certain amount of information, and then it's going to provide a token that you have to provide back to the API to continue, and it will page the next set of data in. So you have, it seems complicated, but even for us, for me at least, as writing this as an absolute Python beginner, we can accomplish this in 50 lines of code or less. And now we're retaining all of our activity events to a bronze lakehouse. So not going to go into the code itself in incredible detail, but the gist of it is we connect to our activity events endpoint. We get all of our logs for a certain time range, and we save those to our destination, where the destination for us is a lakehouse, and we retain these in Parquet format. Technically, you could also write these straight to Delta, and you could have an append-only Delta table that just continues to accumulate the logs. You can enrich this with additional metadata. So with this, we're adding in like year, month, and day columns, and then you can put on your own logging frameworks around this if you would like. So that's the activity events, and that is our first ingredient. The second ingredient is going to be the most complicated, or sorry, this is the admin APIs. So these are quite simple, actually. So as we get into the admin APIs, you're going to want to authenticate, and there are, I'm using a service principal. So you just build your authentication. If you set up a service principal, you will get a client ID and a client secret to pass in. I recommend using something like Azure Key Vault if possible, and not saving those secrets directly within a notebook. You can also, if you're doing an interactive session, there's a method within Notebook Utils that I believe will allow you to pass in your own authentication. So the fact that you're signed in running the notebook will be sufficient to authenticate back to the API, and you'll be kind of able to use any access that you have yourself as a user. But within this, I've got some demos here where we're calling different APIs and saving the results to a lakehouse. And some of those useful admin APIs that I mentioned earlier, we've got one that tells us refreshables. This more or less returns a table of all of the refreshable semantic models within your environment. You can filter that down if you choose. You don't have to. If you leave it kind of unfiltered, you'll get back everything within the capacity so long as you have access to it. And this will give you information like how often does the model refresh? What kind of storage format is the model? What was the last refresh status? Did it fail? And then I believe it will give you trends up to, I think it's the last 60 refreshes or the last 7 days, whichever comes first. You will get kind of the statistics of the average refresh duration, the median refresh duration, and some useful statistics about your refreshes. You can, of course, get some metadata around your capacities. So the workspace scanning is really based on going into the content of the workspaces. So it'll tell you, for example, what capacity the workspace is assigned to, but the capacities endpoint will give you some additional information about the capacity, like is it a P1, is it an F64, who are the admins, some other information like that that we can save into a capacities table. We've got things like tenant settings. So I'm going to show this demo actually within Semantic Link Labs, but you can now, as of this year, you can run an API that will tell you all of the tenant level settings within your environment, what the values are things enabled or disabled, and then who has access to that setting if it's something that only a specific Entra ID group has been granted access to. We've got one down here for pipelines and pipeline deployments. Again, I'm not going to go through this line by line, but this is going out and it is collecting all of our deployment pipelines. And then within those, it's finding all of the recent pipeline operations. All of these APIs, they're going to retain data for a limited time. So you need to be mindful that you're querying these somewhat often according to how often you actually deploy. So I think these will get the last 20 or 30 deployments until, again, when you exceed that, the new deployments are going to start evicting the old ones from the memory, so to speak. So you want to definitely collect this and retain it into the future if you want that extra detail about these deployments. And then apps and app users, because until we have the new org apps within Fabric completely online, your workspace apps are still not. The workspace apps, the classic apps, are not an artifact within the workspace. They're kind of a separate beast. So there's dedicated APIs to go get the app metadata and the app users metadata as well. So again, some of these have options. For the most part, I'm running them wide open and I'm collecting all of the detail. Most of them let you filter down to a specific app or a specific workspace and only get the information that you're interested in. That's the gist of those are the extra admin APIs that I'm going to be calling for this solution. And then our most important data source, I would say, is going to be the metadata scanning. I include a link to this within the presentation, but the metadata scanning, there's an entire section about guidance for this that's included within the governance documentation for Fabric. And then I think there's another Power BI version of this article as well that's essentially the same. But this is going to go over the 4 APIs that are involved in scanning your metadata. So the first step that we're going to do is we're going to actually perform a full scan of the entire environment, which is going to give us, we're going to call an API that gives us a complete list of every single workspace in the tenant. And then we kind of chunk up that list of workspaces, and then we get information for each chunk. And really, that's just in the interest of this is going to return a lot of data. So you want to be mindful of your chunks. You may even find that you want to divide maybe into smaller chunks. I think in our environment, we do something like 20 or 25 at a time. And then for each of those chunks, we call another API that scans. So we get our list of workspaces, we divide it up into a manageable size, and then for each unit, we go and get our scans underway. And then for each scan that we kick off, we're going to get back a response URI that tells us where do we go to get information about the results of that scan. So this is definitely the most involved. There's 4 different APIs in the mix. We have to trigger these scans, and then we have to wait for them to complete. So you kind of have to hit these URIs every few seconds to tell, hey, is my scan done? Is my scan done? Eventually, when it's finished, it will give you a URI to call in the final step. So it'll tell you the scan has succeeded, and then we can go and feed in our scan ID and get all of our data back. So we're going to get a JSON payload in return that tells us all of our workspaces and the information about the items within those. This is going to be a pretty complex return object because it's super nested. You're going to see you've got your Fabric items in there. You've got your semantic models, and within the models, you're going to have things like the users and the measures, and all these different things are going to be nested. So you're not getting back a nice clean table that you just save the table. You're going to have to do some transformation along the way. When we get to the Semantic Link Labs, I thought it was interesting. So Michael Kowalski, I think on LinkedIn the other day, he alluded to the fact that eventually Semantic Link Labs is going to support the scanning API. So if you're looking at all this and you're saying, hey, this is just, I don't really want to mess with all this. I would love to get the inventory, but this is just a little bit too much. I would say either get started with the sample code that I'll show here today, or if you just wait a little bit longer, you may be able to do a much easier version of this directly within Semantic Link. And then this scanning API is fully incremental, which is fantastic. You can go and feed in a date time that says only get me the workspaces that have had a modification since a certain time. So you don't have to do that full tenant scan every single night unless you want to. But certainly you could only get the changes since the last time you ran the scan if you maintain the modified since parameter in some type of watermark table. So again, I will share the notebook code, but I'm just going to go through our implementation that scans the metadata scanning API. It sounds complicated, but I promise it's not so bad. You can actually implement this one in, again, about 50 lines of code. There's all kinds of nice parameters for it. So we can do things like exclude personal workspaces if you don't really want to inventory those. You can exclude inactive workspaces if you don't want those. And then you can determine, do I want to get back my artifact users? Do I want to get my DAX expressions? Do I want to get the metadata like the schemas from within the semantic model? So if you want this to be a little bit simpler and have less data total to go through, you can introduce some of these filters and it will make the overall result less complex to parse. In our case, we're getting absolutely everything, and then we save it. So in this case, this is an important point. So anytime that you're working with API data, what we've learned, fortunately not the hard way, we kind of read this as a best practice, is you probably don't want to turn everything into a table right away and save it, because these are complex nested JSON files, and you don't always know when Microsoft might introduce a new piece of data or a new nested section into the API result. So if you realize later that something new has been added and you want to go back and modify your process to accommodate that, if you're not saving the raw JSON, you will have basically lost data. So I always recommend when you're calling these APIs, save the raw result somewhere, especially this one. So we save all of these JSON files into the lakehouse on their own, and then only later do we go through those and parse them into something that we can hit with SQL and hit with Power BI. But again, the overall approach is exactly what I outlined from the documentation. We are searching for our list of workspaces. You can filter this down if you would like. You don't have to do all workspaces at once if you're only interested in a few. So we get our list of workspaces, we chunk them up, we scan them one chunk at a time, and then we wait until we have a success status on the scan, and then we take our results using the scan ID and we save those off into a lakehouse. And the end result is, I'll just show what that actually looks like in the lakehouse. While I pull this up, how are we doing on time, Kevin? I want to be mindful that I don't go into things in too much detail depending on how much
Yeah,
time I have.
I mean, we could go after 7 o'clock. It's about 8 minutes to 7 now, but
Okay,
it's we're not as
I'll keep
stringent
us
that we'd
moving
have.
here.
Yeah, we don't have to stop at 7. You could go over, whatever. So I think people are getting some good information out of this. Dan just shouted out to you. There was a great call out about keeping the JSON. Fernando's put a couple questions in about semantic link and, if
Okay.
it's easier to code in semantic link. And I think you mentioned you're going to get to that a little bit later, right? So we'll hold
Yeah, I'll
off
show
on
some
Fernando's.
demos. I'll show
Yeah.
some demos of Semantic Link, and what you'll see is they're nice and easy, right? So what he's doing is he's wrapping all of these APIs in these nice little functions, and all you
Hmm.
have to do is paste that function into a notebook and call it for a few parameters, and you get the result back. So I'll show a few ways to get some data using Semantic Link Labs, and you may decide that that's the way you want to go for everything, and you may look at the documentation and say, hey, forget some of this. I'm going to use Semantic Link for all of it.
Yeah, but I still appreciate how you go through the documentation and how things work, because then even when you see how easy it is another way, you still might
Yeah,
want to know about what they're doing there for you. So great. Okay,
exactly.
continue.
And when you see when some of these features come online, it really gives you the appreciation for what he's done and what they've done, either Michael and Semantic Link Labs, or as they start to roll these into maybe the base Semantic Link. It's making things a lot easier and a lot faster. But here, just really quickly before I move on to Semantic Link, I wanted to show kind of what. So yeah, here's in our Bronze Lake House, we've got a series of every time we run a metadata scan, we're going to be saving it into a partitioned file structure, by month, by day. And then within that, we'll have all of our result packages. So if we ever come back later and we say, you know what, actually, I want to build our silver tables or our gold tables in a different way. I want to reprocess these, or maybe I want to go back and build some type of slowly changing dimension. We have all of our historical data we can go back and reprocess. We haven't lost a thing. This is also great for audit trail. So a question you may encounter would be, who had access to something back on a particular date? You may be able to answer that if you're retaining these scan results. And with that, I will jump into, again, I mentioned there were 4 different sources. So we've gone through 3 of the 4. So we've looked at our activity events, our metadata scan, our miscellaneous APIs, and now I'm going to look at the best practice analyzer. So hopefully you guys, everybody's heard of best practice analyzer, at least heard of it. So this is a tool that until now, you've kind of had to work with external tools like Tabular Editor or Measure Killer or some of these other implementations that let you apply a list of rules to your semantic models. And what this is going to do is going to give you back like a health check on your models that's going to tell you a list of possible issues. It's going to rank those issues in terms of severity. It's going to give you links to the documentation and the best practices of why they're considered issues in the first place. And it's a great tool if you're trying to go out and determine the health of your environment. Maybe you have some models out there that it was more of a self-service deployment. Maybe it's a business user who maintains that. Well, let's say that you're combining these BPA results with your usage data, and you see that you have a model out there that has some big issues, yet it's getting a lot of usage. You may want to prioritize that accordingly of trying to optimize that model. But now we don't have to use an external tool to use a BPA scan. We can use Semantic Link Labs. So I'm going to jump into our final kind of data collection notebook. And with Semantic Link Labs, all you have to do is install it. So I've got a single liner here that's installing Semantic Link Labs. I'm importing some of the features of that overall library and giving them names. There is a nice documentation page. I will link to this that goes through every single sub-package within SemPy. The one I'm going to focus on is this. So we have this lovely function that came out, I think in September, called Run Model BPA Bulk. And he had one before that would let you run the best practice analyzer against a single model at a time, which was fantastic. That was great. But now we can run it against all accessible workspaces. So if you're running it under a service principal, you're going to be able to scan every single model that service principal has access to or read access to. And you can save this nice data frame that has all of your results directly to your lakehouse. And then if you just want to scan a few workspaces in particular, you can pass in the list of workspaces that you want. And then you can do, this is very nice, you can also tell it which models to skip. So there's a list of models that you may not want to scan every single time. For example, down here. So in here, when I run this function, I'm telling it to skip some of these historical usage metric models that Microsoft has had. You may have things like this floating in your environment where I don't want to scan BPA for these built-in types of models, and I don't want to scan this model because this is actually the model that we're going to generate here at the end of the demo. But when you compare it to the raw API calls, this is extremely easy, right? All you have to do is run a single function and tell it to scan your workspaces and, specify what you don't want it to scan. Keep in mind, if you're going to do a bulk scan of Best Practice Analyzer, you probably do want to narrow this down in some way. I would suggest maybe restricting to production workspaces or only, some type of criteria. Because if you scan everything, I am positive our tenant is not the biggest, but this one took, an hour and 14 minutes to complete last time it was scanned. Just something to keep in mind if you are doing a full scan that includes, I believe this can also do things like the tabular Vertipack analyzer, and you can get statistics back. If you're doing things like that, it just makes it take longer to execute. So just be mindful of how much you're scanning at once. But the lovely thing about this is without any additional configuration, this is going to save a Delta table into my Lakehouse that has all of the BPA results. Or optionally, you can say, don't give me the Delta table directly, just give me a data frame with all the results. And you could use that directly in the notebook. So if I go up to this first demo, this is the response it gives. So if I just scan I'll scan the single development model, and I get back my BPA results that categorize everything into the different categories of potential issues with the model. And then scrolling through, it will have everything in a nice HTML table with the severity of the issue. What is the source of the issue? Is it a measure? Is it a table? Is it something else? And then the name of the rule. And if the rule has documentation, it'll either pop up a tooltip that tells me why this is a rule, or if there's additional documentation, it will actually give me a hyperlink that takes me directly to the documentation for why this is a best practice. So if you're just trying to do some ad hoc analysis, if you have some models out there, maybe you prioritize your models in order of views and you say, I'm going to start scanning my most viewed content and see where we maybe have high priority issues, even if you're not going to save them right off the bat. Before, I'm a big fan of Tabular Editor. I was used to running BPA within that tool, but maybe you're in an environment where you don't have third-party tooling, or you don't want to, understandably, maybe you don't want to pay for a third-party tool. You just want to be able to run BPA in directly from Fabric. So this is a tool to do that. And then once you have saved the BPA results, you can create a direct lake semantic model, again, with a single line of code. It'll create a model out of that table. It takes a few minutes to complete. And then you can create a report on top of that. So you don't even have to go through the effort of developing the report from scratch. You can actually just use the one that is out of the box. So the notebook generates this report, and by default, it's going to save it into the same workspace as where the notebook ran. And from here, you can analyze all of the different violations. What are the severity? Is it just a warning message? You can go in and you can view all the rules. But this is a great place to begin. And again, you don't have to, this is getting into the custom territory without having to develop everything from scratch. I was able to come up with this BPA report in, three cells of code, right? Scan the models, create the semantic model, create the report. And now we can start to look at best practice violations.
Unbelievable. That just looks so easy. Everybody go do this tomorrow.
Yeah, this is great. This is a great place to begin. Of just, if you know that you've got your maybe you've got some performance issues, maybe in your everything dovetails together. So you may see in your capacity metrics, I've got these spikes in these interactive queries where I know that there's something unoptimized about this model. It keeps having these performance issues. Well, go and scan it with Best Practice Analyzer, and you may immediately find some violations here that you can dig into and resolve the performance issues. And I'm going to, so I will commit to, providing the sample notebooks. I'm going to skip through some of the intermediate transformations. There's the long and short of it is we're taking that raw JSON and we're building tables. So we're building an apps table, an app users table, a capacities table. We're doing different things. So I would come back to this and go through it if you're interested. But you can start to build a nice consolidated gold lakehouse with all of your monitoring data. So at the end of this, I can save those same BPA results. I can query them with SQL. So now I have all of my BPA results for my capacity. I could go in, I could build a data catalog because I've done my metadata scanning. I can go in and see all of my data sets and tables. What are the measures within those? What are the DAX expressions? You can turn this into documentation that is available for the users. And this is fantastic because have you ever been working on a model and you need to do something, you need to implement a DAX pattern and you know that you've done it with a similar project, but you can't quite place where you've done it before? I mean, you can go in, if you build a catalog with this, hey, what was that? What was that one function that I used, rank X or something like that? And, just search the expressions and you can probably find it. So building a data catalog and making this available to your users is a great use of your monitoring data. And then, of course, activity events. This is a table where the schema is constantly evolving. For our monitoring solution, we narrow it down heavily, and we're only looking at primarily at the time we were looking at Power BI data. Now we'll probably come back and expand this to look at some Fabric things as well. But we're just gathering things like the report IDs, the data set IDs. Were they viewing it? Were they exporting something? What were the different operations? And build a nice fact table for that. And then, as again, I know we're going over a little bit, but to wrap it all up, you can start to build some really nice custom usage reporting. So I'll show some sampling of some of the things we track. So you can start to look at, for the last X number of months, what were my daily active users per capacity. I've got multiple capacities in here for this demo. I'm just going to stay with the smaller capacity. So I can see it's got 100 daily users. It's got, 300 users monthly, 500 within the entire period. I can see the view trends. I can start to cross filter by workspace and report. And then you can look at some analysis that compares, how many views versus how many users, and start to break things down and see what content is the most impactful and the most used. And then start to cross-reference that with performance and capacity. And you can start to make some decisions. And then getting into the more detail, a very useful view that we have found is to cross-reference report details with user details. So if I go in and I'm just going to look at like last 90 days of data compared to the 90 days before that, and start to do things like what is the usage trend, start to see the changes, where do we have new reports within the environment, where do we have new users within the environment. So you'll start to see trends. You'll start to see, hey, somebody joined the organization and suddenly they're our top user within the last month. Or, hey, I know there's these folks from senior leadership who I really think should be using a certain report. Are they actually? You can start to answer questions like that. And then again, maybe you have opportunities for action like, hey, this person was consistently using a report and suddenly the usage has fallen off for a few weeks. I should go follow up with that person and see, did something change? Did the report no longer meet your needs? What can we do to improve that? But this is the type of reporting you can start to do purely with just knowing your views and knowing your report inventory. And because I know we are past 8 o'clock, or I think 7 o'clock there, I will wrap it up here and I'll take questions instead.
Yeah, I think that's great. So this report that you're showing, this is something you built, right? That's not
Yeah,
like
this
you
this
just
is
had the one line
completely
of code.
custom.
Okay.
Yeah, this is something we built, right? So you'll get some native reports out of Semantic Link Labs, but this is like what we're doing with our Gold Lake House filled with our activity events and our report inventory. This is the type of reporting that we would build for ourselves.
And so Dan wants to know, to do that, did you build a star schema model?
Yep. So behind the scenes, there is a star schema. So you can think of, at the center of the star, we have a few fact tables. So we have a fact table for activity events. We have a fact table for user access. So we actually take every different type of user access and we combine it all into a single fact. So whether it is a report, a model, a deployment pipeline, a capacity, we kind of combine that all into a single structure so we can query our user access. And then I believe the third fact table is the BPA results. So we have all of those three are our facts, and then around them we have the dimensions would be things like reports, data flows, users, uh, semantic models, things of that nature. We build out the DIMs as well.
Nice.
And then again,
Fernando
I'm
also
not.
wants to go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to
Uh,
say we also, as I mentioned, we combine it with some internal sources. So that model would also have things like tickets related to our environment. It would have things like
hmm.
external ETL logs and some things of that nature.
And then Fernando wanted to know what size capacity that you're using.
The demo I'm showing, actually, there's 3 or 4 different capacities that we have globally. All of them are P1s. And then I think maybe we have one business unit that has something smaller that just recently was stood up, but pretty much everything is a P1 for us, soon to be an F64.
And then, sorry, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this name, but the question is there any API way available to get the capacity usage data
Great
in real
question.
time? I don't,
There,
I'm,
there is
go
not.
ahead.
So
Yeah.
there's two things that I really, really want out of the Fabric team, which was I love activity events. I love metadata scanning. I need a way to retain my job logs. So everything that we have, I'm going to jump back into screen sharing to display this. So you may have seen things like the monitor hub, which shows you your
Hmm.
job status. You may have seen like, again, within your capacity details, I want APIs that surface this data. And actually, at the end of the presentation, what I call out is I think the way they're going to introduce it is going to be the real time hub. So they previewed this at FabCon Europe. I saw some of the images of the presentations, but there are going to be new data sources showing up in the real time hub. I think by the end of the year is what they said at FabCon. And this is a demo of what it looked like from the screen they showed, where today we already have this. We already have our workspace item events that you can collect into a lakehouse or a KQL database. In the future, you'll be able to connect directly to all of your capacity events and save those indefinitely. So that's going to be fantastic to not have to use that direct query data set that's only the last 14 days. You may want to see long term what his capacity looked like, and you can see those macro trends that maybe this notebook is being slowly more inefficient over time. But I think this is the path they're going to take. Maybe they'll give us an API, but certainly it looks like they're going to give us our job details and our capacity details in the real-time hub. So definitely
Yeah.
check out the real-time hub if you haven't already.
Yeah. The job details, right? Just even getting that some job failed
Yeah,
and let it get picked up and send an event immediately, right? Rather than in all the pipelines having to code all the stuff to say, did this fail? Did that fail? You know?
yeah, it's a
Um,
pain point for us of having to track all the different jobs that are running. Did they
yeah.
did have are they running too long? Are
Hmm.
we having to go in and configure every single pipeline with different failure conditions? Like I just want to be able to query these logs and to see the trends.
Exactly. Dan, yeah, come on off mute and ask your question.
So with like ADF, you can log to log analyzer. I know this is kind of a sideways question, but with the Fabric jobs, can you log those to log analyzer? Because if you can, you might want to look at that. You can set alerts on like log analyzer queries. So that might be worth, if you're talking about trying to keep track of all these logs and when they fail and that kind of stuff,
That's a
that might
great
be an
point. I'm
option.
not exactly sure if Fabric artifacts are captured with the log analytics integration. I'd have to follow up on that. Um, I don't know if they're included or not. Hope if they are, that would be another great option.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
know
to my to
Power
my
BI
knowledge,
does,
they're not today.
they're not. Okay.
Yeah, you can't, even if you attached log analytics to the workspace, I don't think the Fabric items get put in with those events.
Nuts.
I think a lot of people, I think there's actually an ideas thing out there for that because that's been discussed, and stuff like that. So yeah, hopefully something like that will come about, but
Gotcha.
don't know. Yep. Anybody else have a question, or was there anything that I missed? I know somebody RR put in a couple questions that was not related to the presentation. So again, I put the link to the Thursday session. That's really the good open session that, you know, we could talk about anything. If there's problems that you're having, those two questions that you put in could be kind of interesting to see if others have hit, and see if we could come up with a solution for you. So join us on Thursday and find that out. Before I turn off the recording, any other questions? Anything else? All right, let me turn that off.